The city was exhausted. By the mid-1970s, New York was broke, crime was high, and trust in institutions was eroding. Yet behind the boarded, up storefronts and flickering neon, another economy was thriving, one that didn't appear on any tax roll or city budget sheet. Phones rang in back rooms and basements, handling a steady stream of whispers. Point spreads, race results, football lines, cash pickups. In court documents and newspaper headlines, one name appeared again and again as the man at the center of it all: James "Jimmy" Napoli. Federal agents described a sprawling, illegal gambling network that seemed to touch every borough and stretch far beyond the city limits. To some, he was a shadowy symbol of organized crime's grip on the everyday habits of ordinary Americans. To others within his world, he was simply Jimmy, a bookmaker who had spent a lifetime turning wagers into an empire. His rise did not happen overnight. It was the product of a particular city, a particular era, and a particular generation of immigrants, children who learned early that the official economy had no place for them. To understand how James Napoli became one of the most notorious bookmakers in modern American history, the story has to return to the beginning, before the wiretaps, before the indictments, back to a crowded city where millions of newcomers fought to survive, and where the earliest traces of his life first appear in the historical record. James Napoli entered the world in New York City in November 1911, at a time when the very idea of Italian-American was still new. His surname pointed back across the Atlantic to the region around Naples, part of the immense wave of southern Italian migration that had transformed American cities in the decades before his birth. By the time he was a small child, hundreds of thousands of Italians had crowded into tenements across Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. They found work where they could, laying bricks, hauling freight, sewing in garment shops, selling produce from pushcarts. Historians of the period describe streets thick with the smells of cooking oil and coal smoke, children darting between horse carts, and languages, Neapolitan, Sicilian, Standard Italian, English, blending into a unique neighborhood sound. It was in this atmosphere that the boy who would become Jimmy Nap took his first steps. The documentary record of Napoli's early years is sparse. Law enforcement files that would later track his movements and associations focus on his adult criminal career, not on the domestic details of his childhood. There are no surviving memoirs from Napoli, no detailed interviews that walk us through his school days or the layout of his family's apartment. What is known, from government records and later investigative reporting, is that he was born and raised in New York City to Italian immigrant parents, and came of age in the same crowded, working-class environment that shaped so many of his contemporaries who drifted, in one form or another, into the orbit of organized crime. To understand the forces that shaped him, historians look instead at the broader conditions surrounding Italian-American youth in New York in the 1910s and 1920s. These were neighborhoods where discrimination was common and opportunity scarce. Italians were often viewed with suspicion by employers and authorities alike. Newspaper editorials of the era railed against foreign criminality, too easily conflating poverty, ethnicity, and crime. Many families, including those who would later see their sons named in police files, struggled simply to keep a roof over their heads. Census data and settlement house reports from the period describe long work hours, low pay, and overcrowded housing as the norm. In such communities, informal economies flourished. Side jobs, off-the-books labor, and increasingly small-scale illegal gambling. When Napoli was 8 years old, the United States embarked on a national experiment that would help define his generation's relationship to the underworld: Prohibition. Beginning in 1920, the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages became illegal. In theory, the law was meant to uplift American society. In practice, it created a vast black market overnight. For a boy growing up in New York's ethnic enclaves, the change was impossible to miss. Corner saloons were shuttered or went underground. New kinds of men appeared on the streets: bootleggers, lookouts, and enforcers whose profits came from making sure people could still drink. These years were formative for many future figures in organized crime. They watched as ordinary customers willingly ignored the law, and as illegal entrepreneurs amassed wealth and influence that far outstripped that of the neighborhood grocers or factory foremen. As Prohibition took hold, Italian-American gangs that had previously dealt in petty extortion or neighborhood protection expanded into the more lucrative trades of liquor distribution, gambling, and vice. This was the period that saw the rise of figures like Charles Lucchese, and the consolidation of what would become known as the American Mafia. For young Italians in New York, the contrast could be stark. The official routes out of poverty, school, factory work, small business ownership, promised at best a slow path to modest stability. The illicit world, visible in expensive suits, big cars, and neighborhood deference, offered a faster, if far more dangerous, route to money and status. Many resisted the lure, others did not. Napoli's later life suggests that he, too, was pulled toward the shadow economy that had taken root in his own backyard. By the mid-1920s, as Napoli moved through his teenage years, illegal betting had become a fixture of everyday life in many working-class neighborhoods. The numbers game, a form of lottery based on daily financial or racing figures, allowed customers to wager small sums with the hope of a modest payout. Horse racing, boxing, and later professional baseball and football drew wagers as well. Social historians interviewing former residents of New York's Italian and African-American neighborhoods describe a world in which placing a bet with a local numbers man or bookmaker was as routine as buying a newspaper. For immigrants and their children living on the margin, the chance of a sudden windfall, however statistically unlikely, held a particular appeal. It was in this context that Napoli would eventually find his life's illegal trade. Unlike higher-profile mob figures whose childhood antics were recorded in police blotters and later mythologized in memoirs, Napoli's early encounters with law enforcement are not widely documented in public sources. When his name starts to appear in the historical record in a sustained way, it is already linked to gambling and to the broader structure of organized crime in New York. Yet those later files often refer to him as a long-time bookmaker, implying that by the time federal agencies began to pay serious attention, he had already spent years, likely decades, immersed in the mechanics of illegal betting. Whether his first steps into that world came as a teenage runner ferrying bets for older men, as a clerk keeping track of wagers in a back room, or as a small-scale bookmaker working his own corner clients, the pattern fits the established pathways that criminologists have documented for his cohort. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, deepened the conditions that had already made the underworld attractive to some. As banks failed and factories closed, unemployment among young men in immigrant neighborhoods soared. Emergency relief programs provided some relief, but not enough. In this bleak environment, illegal economies did not shrink. In many cases, they expanded. Gambling, in particular, often increased during hard times, as people grasped for any chance, however slim, to escape their circumstances. Contemporary social workers' reports from New York describe families pooling small coins for a daily number bet, hopping for a payout that could cover rent or medical bills. For aspiring bookmakers, the Depression years offered both a steady supply of customers and a diminished capacity among law enforcement to aggressively police all forms of vice. If the early 1930s pushed many young men toward informal and illegal work, they also marked a major reorganization of the American underworld. The bloody conflicts of the Prohibition era gave way, in the wake of the 1931 Castellamer's War, to a more structured, business-like form of organized crime. Italian-American crime families, including the organization that would later be known as the Lucchese family, divided territories and rackets, established organizational hierarchies, and tried, within their own violent logic, to bring order to what had been a chaotic world. It was within this emerging system that law enforcement sources would later place James Napoli. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, American society itself was changing rapidly. Prohibition had been repealed in 1933, eliminating one major illegal market, but gambling and other vice industries remained illegal and profitable. World War II reshaped the city once again. Many Italian-American men enlisted or were drafted. Others worked in war industries, shipyards, and factories operating around the clock. Wartime wages improved some families' conditions, but the war also brought new opportunities for black market activity, rationed goods, stolen materials, and, of course, continued illegal betting among workers and soldiers alike. FBI and local police intelligence from this period note that while violent gang wars had subsided compared to the Prohibition years, structured gambling rackets were thriving, often with the quiet cooperation of corrupt local officials. It was in this environment, post-Prohibition, mid-Depression, and then wartime, that Napoli moved from being one more young man from an immigrant neighborhood to a person of interest in the eyes of authorities. Later federal profiles tie him specifically to illegal gambling operations and identify him as part of a network associated with what law enforcement termed the Lucchese, or Lucchese crime family, named after boss Thomas Lucchese. The Lucchese organization, with roots in East Harlem and the Bronx, was known for specializing in labor racketeering, garment industry control, and gambling operations. While the precise moment at which Napoli became an associate of this family is not fixed in surviving public records, by the time detailed surveillance and informant reports began to circulate in the post-war decades, his affiliation was accepted as a given within law enforcement circles. Socially, the transition from neighborhood bookmaker to a man linked with a major crime family was significant. Within organized crime, gambling was often seen as a comparatively safe racket, a business that, while illegal and harmful in many ways, did not always carry the same immediate threat of violence as narcotics trafficking or certain forms of extortion. That perception sometimes obscured the real damage gambling could do: addiction, financial ruin, and the corruption of public institutions tasked with enforcing the law. Men like Napoli, who focused on betting rather than more overtly violent crimes, could sometimes pass for ordinary businessmen in their communities. They ran candy stores, social clubs, or small offices as fronts, blending into the background of neighborhood life even as they managed vast flows of illegal money. The broader society in which Napoli operated was ambivalent about such figures. On the one hand, newspapers ran exposés about syndicate gambling, warning of its corrupting influence. Police periodically raided betting parlors and arrested local bookmakers. On the other hand, many citizens continued to place bets with them, often rationalizing that a small wager on a ball game or a daily number was harmless entertainment. This tension between public condemnation and private participation helped sustain the gambling underworld and the careers of men like Napoli. It also complicated later efforts by law enforcement to dismantle the networks they built, because the demand for illegal betting services remained strong even as headlines decried organized crime. By the end of the 1940s, when Napoli was approaching middle age, the contours of his life's path were set. He was no longer a youth navigating the uncertainties of an immigrant childhood, but an adult deeply embedded, according to law enforcement accounts, in the illegal gambling economy of New York. The United States was entering a new era: suburbanization, the rise of television, and a booming post-war economy. Yet in the shadows of this prosperity, the machinery of organized crime continued to operate, feeding off old habits and new opportunities alike. For James Napoli, the decades ahead would see his profile rise from that of a relatively obscure bookmaker to one of the most prominent names associated with illicit gambling in America, a shift that would bring wealth, notoriety, and repeated clashes with the law. The seeds of that transformation had been planted long before, in the crowded streets and constrained choices of his youth, in a city that had taught him that there was always another market waiting to be exploited, just beyond the reach of the law. In the years after World War II, New York City seemed, on the surface, to be turning a corner. Soldiers came home, factories retooled for peacetime, and the long-deferred dreams of immigrant families appeared, for some, to inch closer to reality. The city's Italian neighborhoods changed along with the country. Children of the first generation moved into slightly better housing, attended high school in greater numbers, and found work beyond the hardest kinds of manual labor. But the shadow economy that had grown up in those same streets did not disappear. If anything, it became more tightly organized and more profitable. Illegal gambling, cards, numbers, horse racing, and increasingly sports betting remained one of its central pillars. It was in this maturing underworld that James "Jimmy" Napoli began to stand out, not as a street-level tough, but as a specialist in turning other people's wagers into steady, reliable profit. By the late 1940s, Napoli had, in the view of later law enforcement reports, dedicated himself fully to bookmaking. The work did not look glamorous up close. It meant long hours with ledgers and telephones, studying racing forms and sports pages, adjusting point spreads, and constantly calculating risk. Those who knew the trade described a craft that blended mathematics, psychology, and endurance. A bookmaker who misjudged the odds or let sentimental bets pile up on a neighborhood favorite without proper balance could find a week's work wiped out in a single bad afternoon at the track or stadium. In this world, reputation was everything. Bettors wanted someone who paid on time, who handled volume smoothly, who knew how to set a line that made sense. Other bookmakers, especially smaller operators, wanted a layoff man, someone they could call to pass along excess action when too much money came in on one side of a game. It was this more technical side of the business that, according to investigators who later studied his operations, became Napoli's specialty. The mechanics of the trade in those years were deceptively simple. A customer placed a bet, often through a neighborhood runner, someone who collected cash and recorded wagers at a bar, candy store, or street corner. The runner passed the information to a local bookmaker. That bookmaker, in turn, might call someone higher up the chain, a central figure with the capital and network to absorb hundreds of bets at once from across the city or even beyond it. Napoli worked at this upper tier. He was not the man standing in a smoky backroom taking small bills at the end of a workday. He was the man other bookmakers telephoned when they needed to move risk off their books, the one who set overall lines and coordinated the flow of money behind the scenes. For law enforcement, this kind of figure posed a particular challenge. Police could and did raid individual betting spots, arrest runners, and seize betting slips. But those arrests rarely touched the people who designed the system or reaped the largest profits. The runners were replaceable, the storefronts easily reopened under a cousin's name. In court, most lower-level participants faced only fines or short sentences, especially when judges viewed gambling as a vice but not a serious threat to public safety. The higher-level men, meanwhile, kept their names off official paperwork and stayed away from the most visible aspects of the trade. They maintained legitimate fronts, restaurants, social clubs, small businesses that explained their income and gave them plausible reasons to handle large amounts of cash. By the early 1950s, documents generated by local police intelligence units and later summarized in federal reports identified Napoli as one of those higher-level figures. His name began to appear in the background of gambling cases, sometimes as a person arrested in broader sweeps, sometimes as a subject of surveillance, other times as a figure mentioned by informants trying to explain how money moved through the city's betting networks. The pattern that emerges from those scattered records is of a man who consistently returned to bookmaking, despite periodic legal troubles. Arrest reports from the era, as referenced in later newspaper accounts, show multiple gambling-related charges over the years. Operating a bookmaking establishment, conspiracy to take bets, possession of betting records. In most instances, outcomes ranged from dismissals to fines and relatively short jail terms. Nothing in those early encounters stopped him. If anything, they underscored for him that, compared to other criminal rackets, illegal gambling still carried limited penalties. At the same time, the official view of organized crime in America was shifting. Between 1950 and 1951, the televised hearings of the Senate Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, better known by the name of its chair, Senator S. Kefauver, brought the structure of the syndicate into living rooms across the country. Viewers saw, often for the first time, a systematic presentation of how illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and corruption were linked across city and state lines. The committee's report stressed that bookmaking was not just a harmless sideline, but a major revenue source for organized crime groups, money that could then be used to bribe officials or finance more serious offenses. While James Napoli did not become a household name during these hearings, the type of gambling enterprise he was building fit precisely into the pattern the senators described. For the underworld, the Kefauver investigation and the later Appalachian incident of 1957, when state police stumbled upon a gathering of high-ranking mob figures in upstate New York, were warnings that the era of near anonymity was ending. The federal government, which had long left most gambling enforcement to local authorities, began to take a more active interest. The FBI started what it called the Top Hoodlum program, assigning agents in cities across the country to monitor suspected leaders of organized crime. In New York, that effort meant building files on men across all 5 recognized mafia families, as well as unaffiliated racketeers and figures from other ethnic groups. As the 1950s closed and the 1960s began, Napoli's name was among those circulating in these internal reports as a key player in illegal betting. His connection to the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 major Italian-American organizations controlling organized crime in New York, became clearer in this period. Originating in East Harlem and the Bronx, the Lucchese family had, by mid-century, established itself as a significant power, with interests in garment district rackets, transportation, and gambling. Researchers working with declassified FBI materials and court records note that federal agents consistently listed Napoli as associated with the Lucchese group. Within its structure, he was often described as an important bookmaker, and in some accounts, as a captain, a mid to high-ranking member overseeing his own crew. As with all mafia hierarchies, these titles were somewhat fluid and secretive, but what mattered to investigators was his function. He was viewed as the man orchestrating a large chunk of the family's betting operations. From the perspective of those who used his services, Napoli's growing role was defined less by organizational charts and more by reliability. Other bookmakers contacted him to handle their overflow bets because they understood that he had the capital to pay off winning wagers and the discipline to keep careful records. Those records, often kept in code or disguised as legitimate business entries, were the lifeblood of his operation, but also its greatest vulnerability. Whenever police managed to seize them during raids, they gained insight into the scale of the enterprise. The number of bettors, the sums wagered on particular games, the connections between different bookmakers across boroughs and, sometimes, states. The expansion of his business mirrored broader changes in American culture. As television brought professional sports into homes, interest in betting on those games expanded dramatically. Baseball, boxing, and horse racing had long histories as gambling favorites, but the post-war era saw the rapid rise of professional football as a major betting sport. Point spread wagering, in which bookmakers adjusted the expected winning margin to balance bets on both sides, became a sophisticated subfield of the trade. Men like Napoli, who invested time and effort in understanding teams, injuries, weather, and public sentiment, could use that knowledge to set lines that attracted steady action while minimizing risk. The middle decades of the 20th century, with their explosion of mass sports entertainment, created ideal conditions for someone with his skills. As his betting network grew more complex, the infrastructure around it evolved. What had once been an arrangement dependent on neighborhood runners and face-to-face meetings now relied heavily on telephones. Apartments, storefront back rooms, or small offices were quietly converted into wire rooms, where banks of phones rang constantly on busy sports days and clerks noted bets as quickly as they came in. Law enforcement agents who eventually raided such locations, including those linked to Napoli, described chalkboards or large sheets of paper listing games, code names for bettors, and constantly updated figures showing how much money rested on each outcome. From these spaces, calls extended outward to smaller bookmakers, to out-of-state partners, and sometimes to legitimate businesses willing to provide cover for frequent long-distance calls. The shift to telephone betting created both opportunities and risks. It allowed Napoli and others to reach clients far beyond their immediate neighborhoods, extending their reach across city lines and into suburbs where, increasingly, middle-class bettors lived. But it also opened them to new forms of evidence gathering. Local police and, increasingly, federal agents began to experiment with telephone surveillance. Before the late 1960s, such wiretaps existed in a legally murky space, often conducted without clear warrants or exacerbated by inconsistent court rulings. Even so, occasional interceptions gave authorities a glimpse into betting operations, revealing coded language, call patterns, and the central role played by layoff bookmakers like Napoli. The cat-and-mouse game around surveillance influenced how he and his associates conducted business. Accounts from informants and undercover officers, included in later court documents, describe precautions such as rotating telephone numbers, using pay phones for sensitive communications, and instructing runners to avoid saying specific words that might clearly indicate illegal betting. Instead, they spoke in shorthand or used terms that, on paper, could be mistaken for discussions of legitimate trades. These tactics were not foolproof, but they reflected an awareness that the environment in which they operated was changing. Within his own community, meanwhile, Napoli occupied an ambivalent position. On the one hand, he was seen, especially by those who benefited from his generosity, as a provider. Organized crime figures in his position often distributed money at local events, contributed quietly to church funds, or helped families in temporary hardship with loans. Such gestures reinforced a sense that they were part of the community, not merely predators upon it. On the other hand, the very business that enabled such displays could be deeply corrosive. Gambling debts strained households. People pawned valuables or skipped essential expenses to keep betting. Some fell into persistent addiction. When debts were not repaid, those who worked for bookmakers sometimes turned to intimidation, making clear in non-lethal but unmistakable ways that non-payment had consequences. Even if Napoli himself tried to maintain a distance from the most direct forms of pressure, the system he commanded depended on them. Religious leaders, social workers, and some local politicians recognized these harms and spoke out against the grip of illegal gambling on their neighborhoods. Surveys and reports from the 1950s and 1960s document community meetings where residents complained of the constant presence of numbers runners and bookmakers, the allure of quick money, and the difficulty of shielding young people from the normalization of illegal wagers. Yet the demand did not diminish. The chance, however remote, that a small bet could yield enough money to pay off debts or improve a family's circumstances remained a powerful draw, especially in communities that still bore the scars of earlier poverty and discrimination. In this tension between condemnation and participation, Napoli's reputation grew. He was not, by most contemporary descriptions, a flamboyant figure. He did not seek the media spotlight, and unlike some of his contemporaries, he rarely drew attention through ostentatious displays of wealth. His notoriety came instead from the assessments of those whose business it was to track criminals. Police commissioners, district attorneys, and federal prosecutors began, over the course of the 1960s, to describe him publicly as one of the largest bookmakers in New York, and in some statements, as one of the most significant in the country. Newspaper articles covering gambling raids would single him out by name, identifying him with parenthetical nicknames, Jimmy the Nap, or Jimmy Nap, that signaled both familiarity and suspicion. These labels were not mere rhetoric. They reflected law enforcement's growing frustration with the persistence of illegal betting, despite decades of raids and arrests. Each time authorities dismantled a local operation or jailed a mid-level bookmaker, someone else stepped in to fill the gap, often with Napoli or another high-level figure quietly coordinating behind the scenes. As state governments debated legalizing limited forms of gambling, such as lotteries or regulated horse race betting, they did so in part because of the difficulty in suppressing the illegal versions. Studies commissioned by reform-minded officials showed that illegal bookmakers, collectively, handled enormous sums of money each year, even if the precise numbers were impossible to verify due to the secretive nature of the trade. By the mid-1960s, federal interest in dismantling the financial base of organized crime had translated into new laws. The 1961 Federal Wire Act targeted the use of interstate communications facilities for certain gambling activities, giving prosecutors a tool to pursue bookmakers whose phone calls crossed state lines. Later, the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act established clearer rules for court-ordered wiretaps, providing a legal framework that would underpin more systematic surveillance of suspected mob figures. For a man who oversaw a betting network increasingly dependent on telephones, these developments posed serious new risks. Internally, Napoli adapted by continuing to emphasize his role as a banker or layoff man rather than a direct street bookmaker. This positioning had strategic advantages. If smaller local bookmakers were caught, they might be viewed as the primary offenders, while he appeared, on paper at least, to be further removed from day-to-day operations. However, as investigators followed money trails and analyzed seized betting records, patterns kept leading back to the same names. Among them, again and again in police logs and intelligence summaries, was James Napoli. The accumulating pressure produced a new phase in his life. What had once been, from his perspective, a relatively low-risk occupation, illegal but rarely punished with severe sentences, was now drawing the attention of federal prosecutors determined to demonstrate concrete progress in the fight against organized crime. Napoli's growing notoriety made him a natural target. He had spent decades perfecting the art of staying in the background, but the combination of changing laws, improved investigative tools, and a shifting political climate was about to bring him, unwillingly, to center stage. By the late 1960s, the calm surface of James Napoli's operation was beginning to ripple. For years he had done what men in his position aimed to do: stay off the front page while quietly handling enormous volumes of bets. The system he helped manage was diffuse by design. Street-level bookmakers, bar owners, bartenders, and neighborhood runners took wagers and money. His role was to absorb the risk those local figures could not carry on their own. But the very scale that made him indispensable within the betting world made him a priority for a new generation of investigators. To them, Napoli was no longer just another bookmaker. He symbolized the way organized crime had turned what many Americans still regarded as a casual vice into a sophisticated, untaxed, and deeply entrenched underground industry. The legal tools arrayed against him were stronger than anything his predecessors had faced. The Federal Wire Act of 1961 had criminalized the use of interstate communications facilities for certain gambling purposes. At first, enforcement was uneven, but as the decade wore on, Federal prosecutors began to see in men like Napoli clear test cases. If they could show that his phone calls and the calls of his associates moved bets and betting information across state lines, they could bring federal charges that carried heavier penalties than the sporadic local prosecutions of the past. The 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act then formalized procedures for court-authorized wiretaps, giving investigators a more secure footing to intercept calls and introduce them in court. For an operation that lived on telephones, this combination of statutes posed an existential threat. Napoli adapted as best he could. He and others in his circle relied heavily on coded language, avoided nomming teams or dollar amounts directly, and made frequent use of pay phones and changing numbers. They also tried to route the most sensitive communications through trusted intermediaries rather than allowing bookmakers from distant cities to call central figures directly. Even with these precautions, however, the constant volume of calls generated patterns that were themselves revealing. Investigators, working with pen registers and later wiretaps authorized under the new law, began to map the networks. Numbers linked to apartments and storefronts in New York rang repeatedly to phones in other cities on busy sports days. Calls clustered around kickoff times and post-game windows, suggesting settlements and adjustments. Names that had once been only whispers in informant reports now appeared beside telephone numbers and call logs in organized crime squad files. What distinguished Napoli in those files was not only his association with the Lucchese family, by then firmly established in FBI organizational charts, but the sheer breadth of his alleged reach. Federal and state officials would later testify, and newspapers would repeat, that he functioned as a national clearinghouse for bets, a man whose phone rang not just with calls from Brooklyn and the Bronx, but from bookmakers in other states seeking to balance their books. Estimates of the total volume that moved through his hands varied, and the underground nature of the business made precise figures impossible. Nonetheless, law enforcement officials in the late 1960s and early 1970s routinely described his operation in terms of tens of millions of dollars in wagers per year. Those numbers, while extrapolated from seized records and sample interceptions, underscored why he was worth the sustained attention of federal authorities. The first major cases built around this kind of evidence took time to assemble. Investigators had to do more than catch individual bookmakers taking bets. They had to link those localized activities to a broader conspiracy, and then tie that conspiracy to specific individuals high in the hierarchy. This meant months, sometimes years of patient work, monitoring phone traffic, cultivating informants, following runners, and conducting surveillance outside suspected wire rooms. In some instances, agents observed people carrying stacks of papers or bags into nondescript apartments shortly before major sporting events, then watched as a steady flow of visitors and phone calls marked those locations as command centers. When raids finally came, the goal was to strike multiple locations at once, minimizing the chance that word would spread and records be destroyed. Napoli's name began to appear in connection with several such coordinated actions. In New York, multi-agency task forces made up of federal agents, city police, and state investigators targeted what they described in press conferences as syndicate-controlled betting operations. Raids on apartments and offices associated by investigators with Napoli uncovered ledgers, coded sheets, betting slips, and crucially, address books and telephone lists. These documents, laid out on tables for reporters after the raids, seemed unremarkable to the untrained eye, columns of numbers, initials, and cryptic references. But to prosecutors, they were the tangible threads that could be woven together to show continuity, volume, and centralization. The arrests that followed such raids often swept up dozens of people at once. Runners, clerks, and small bookmakers were charged alongside a much smaller number of alleged higher-ups. In charging papers filed in federal court, prosecutors began to describe Napoli in notably elevated terms. No longer just a bookmaker, he was called the banker of a national network, the man to whom others laid off their excess bets. In some cases, he was labeled the kingpin of the conspiracy, language that served both legal and symbolic purposes. Legally, it justified the idea that he should face more serious penalties than his co-defendants. Symbolically, it allowed officials to present these prosecutions to the public as significant blows against the financial underpinnings of organized crime. In courtroom settings, the contrast between Napoli's public demeanor and the sweeping allegations against him was often striking. Reporters who covered his trials described him as neat, self-contained, and soft-spoken, a far cry from the popular image of the violent gangster. He tended to communicate through attorneys rather than speak at length himself, and he maintained, in legal terms, his innocence, challenging both the sufficiency of the evidence and the methods used to gather it. Defense arguments in such cases frequently attacked wiretap procedures or questioned whether prosecutors had truly shown that the interstate elements required for federal jurisdiction were present. They also emphasized the lack of overt violence in the charges, implicitly urging jurors to see illegal gambling as a regulatory matter rather than a grave crime. Prosecutors countered by placing gambling within the broader narrative of organized crime. They called agents and analysts, who explained how the profits from seemingly mundane wagering could fund bribery, influence public contracts, and support individuals and organizations engaged in other, more clearly harmful activities. They introduced charts showing relationships between defendants, timelines of intercepted calls, and samples of decoded records that linked bets placed in one city to settlements calculated in another. In some trials, bettors themselves testified, often under grant of immunity, about the routine nature of their wagers and the reliability of the bookmakers they used. Their testimony, paradoxically, underscored both the banality and the scale of the enterprise. Banal in that betting had become just another part of their weekly routine, vast in that thousands of people were doing the same thing through interconnected channels. As these cases unfolded, Napoli experienced what, for men in his position, had long been a relatively rare event: substantial federal prison time. Earlier in his career, local gambling convictions had produced limited consequences, brief jail stays, fines, or suspended sentences. But by the early 1970s, after years of investigative effort and new statutes designed with organized crime in mind, at least one major federal case resulted in a significant term of incarceration. Contemporary news accounts reported that he received a multi-year sentence on gambling-related counts tied to the telephone-based network he was alleged to have overseen. Appeals followed, contesting various aspects of the proceedings, but the basic outcome, that a man widely regarded by law enforcement as one of the country's leading bookmakers would serve meaningful time in federal custody, stood. His imprisonment did not, in itself, dismantle the culture of illegal betting that had nurtured his career. Other bookmakers stepped in to handle action while he was away, and some parts of the network reassembled themselves under different names or different nominal leaders. Nonetheless, his conviction marked a psychological turning point within law enforcement. It demonstrated that, with patience and the right tools, authorities could reach beyond the replaceable street-level figures and secure convictions against the higher echelons of gambling operations. It also signaled to other underworld figures that the old calculation, that bookmaking was an illegal trade, but not one likely to produce severe legal consequences, was no longer reliable. Inside prison, Napoli found himself sharing space with a range of offenders, from white-collar criminals to men convicted of violent acts. For a figure who had spent his adult life in the layered social world of New York's underworld, the federal system presented a different kind of hierarchy, one organized less by discrete neighborhood lines and more by institutional rules and routines. Contemporary reporting and later biographical sketches suggest that he maintained contact, through visits and correspondence, with family members, and with associates still operating on the outside. However, the ability to direct complex, multi-city betting operations from behind bars was sharply limited by the close monitoring of communications, and the risk that any overt attempt to run such a business from within the prison would invite new charges. The national environment in which he served his sentence was itself in flux. The early to mid-1970s saw the emergence of new forms of legalized gambling. States that had once condemned lotteries began introducing their own in an effort to generate revenue. Racing commissions adjusted rules to compete with both illegal bookmakers and neighboring jurisdictions. These changes did not eliminate illegal betting. In many cases, people continued to trust their long-standing relationships with neighborhood bookmakers, who offered credit, personal service, and a wider range of wagers than state lotteries permitted. But the line between legal and illegal gambling became more complicated, and the moral rhetoric that had once painted all wagering as vice softened in some quarters. From the standpoint of law enforcement strategy, the focus on Napoli and figures like him was increasingly tied to broader efforts to apply the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, passed in 1970. RICO did not criminalize any new underlying acts. Instead, it allowed prosecutors to charge individuals with participating in an ongoing criminal enterprise if they committed at least 2 specified offenses within a certain period. Illegal gambling offenses counted among those predicates. While Napoli's early major federal cases centered on traditional conspiracy and wire act charges, the legal landscape that awaited him upon his eventual release from prison included this powerful new statute, one that would reshape how prosecutors conceptualized and attacked organized crime. When he completed his first substantial federal sentence and returned to civilian life, he re-entered a city both familiar and altered. New York in the late 1970s was troubled, facing fiscal crises, rising crime rates, and public disillusionment. But it was also in the early stages of transformations that would, in time, change its economy and demographics. For someone of Napoli's generation, the instinct to return to the trade he knew best was strong. Bookmaking had provided his livelihood and prestige for decades. It had also, despite the prison term, reinforced his sense of identity within the Lucchese organization and the wider underworld. In the eyes of law enforcement, however, he was now an established target, a man with a history, a known quantity whose every movement and association would be watched with interest. The surveillance that resumed around him after his release reflected a changed investigative culture. Agents now had years of experience with court-authorized wiretaps. Prosecutors had increasingly sophisticated understandings of how to present complex criminal enterprises to juries. Informant programs, controversial but deeply embedded in organized crime investigations, were more systematic, with formal codes and payment structures. Against this backdrop, any attempt by Napoli to rebuild or expand his old networks risked colliding not with the relatively sporadic enforcement of his early years, but with a sustained, coordinated effort to prevent him from reclaiming his former position atop the illegal gambling world. Yet the demand that had fueled his rise had not disappeared. Sports leagues thrived, televised games became national events, casual interest in betting lines and point spreads filtered into mainstream conversation. The same forces that had made him a lay-off man for bookmakers across the country decades earlier were, if anything, stronger now. The tension between a persistent, widespread appetite for wagering and the evolving legal and investigative frameworks aimed at controlling it framed the next chapter of his life. In that chapter, the pattern that had come to define his career, a cycle of expansion, scrutiny, prosecution, and adaptation, would repeat under new rules and with higher stakes, both for him personally and for the organized crime structures with which he was indelibly linked. When James Napoli walked out of federal custody and back onto New York streets, He returned as an older man into a city that had grown harsher and more uncertain. The optimism and relative order of the early post-war years were gone. New York in the late 1970s was marked by a fiscal crisis, shrinking public services, and rising anxiety about crime. Subway cars were scarred with graffiti. Entire blocks in some neighborhoods bore the marks of arson and abandonment. Yet beneath the visible decay, some old structures endured. Among them was the culture of betting that had underpinned Napoli's career. People still wagered on horse races, football games, and the daily numbers. They still sought out bookmakers they trusted, even as states introduced legal lotteries and other regulated games in an effort to divert that money into public coffers. For law enforcement, the man they now watched was no longer simply one bookmaker among many. Years of investigation and a high-profile federal conviction had turned Napoli into a symbol of a particular strain of organized crime. In internal memos, agents referred to him not in the abstract but as a known quantity, a Lucchese family figure with decades of experience in illegal gambling and a demonstrated ability to coordinate activity far beyond his immediate surroundings. He had become, in the language of prosecutors and reporters alike, one of the country's most significant bookmakers, a status that guaranteed intense scrutiny of his every move. That scrutiny began almost as soon as he was released. Surveillance units noted his visits to social clubs and restaurants long associated with the Lucchese organization. Some of those establishments had been fixtures for years, modest storefronts with frosted windows or unmarked doors, places where older men sat for hours over coffee or cards. To outsiders, they could look like harmless gathering spots. To investigators, they were potential command posts where business, legal and otherwise, was quietly conducted. Whenever Napoli appeared at such locations, plainclothes officers lingered outside, recording license plates and faces, trying to match them against existing files. What made those observations more than routine was the context in which they occurred. By this point, the federal government's strategy against organized crime had shifted decisively away from headline-grabbing raids and toward long-term cases built under RICO. Instead of focusing on isolated incidents, a single raid on a gambling den, a lone bribery attempt, prosecutors aimed to show that particular individuals were part of ongoing criminal enterprises. In theory, this approach allowed them to address the underlying structures that had allowed figures like Napoli to survive wave after wave of short-term crackdowns. In practice, it required even more patience and documentation than before. The temptation, for some men in his position emerging from prison in their 60s, was to step back. Age and health problems, which were real concerns for many long-time mob figures, provided a plausible excuse to retire or at least reduce their exposure. Some did just that, becoming semi-retired advisors who drew respect within their circles but no longer involved themselves deeply in day-to-day operations. In Napoli's case, the historical record suggests a more complicated picture. He did not resume his public activities with the swagger of a younger man oblivious to risk. Yet prosecutors in the late 1970s and early 1980s would again and again describe him as an active participant in major bookmaking operations. Whether he saw himself as simply returning to the only trade he had ever truly mastered, or whether obligation to his criminal associates played a role, his name once more surfaced at the center of large gambling investigations. As in earlier decades, the core product was information and risk management. Bettors rarely, if ever, dealt with him directly. They called local bookmakers, placed bets at bars or through workplace contacts, and perhaps never heard the name Jimmy Knapp. But behind those visible interactions lay a familiar structure: smaller bookmakers passing excess bets up the chain, shared line setting to keep odds consistent across regions, and central figures who balanced books by taking on risk others did not want. Intercepted conversations from later cases, as summarized in court documents and news reports, captured bookmakers in distant cities referring to a central banker in New York, someone whose limits were higher, and whose capacity to absorb large swings in betting results was greater than their own. While names were often omitted or spoken only in code on those calls, prosecutors argued that the patterns pointed once more toward Napoli. The renewed investigations that grew from such leads were increasingly multi-jurisdictional. State authorities in New York, supported by federal agencies, brought cases that alleged gambling operations stretching across several states. When they unveiled indictments at press conferences, attorneys general and district attorneys used language calibrated both to the courtroom and to public opinion. They described national or interstate betting networks, emphasized the millions of dollars in alleged wagers handled each year, and often singled out Napoli as a central organizer or financier. In some instances, they claimed that the volume of bets passing through his network approached or exceeded the handle of legal operations in certain states, a comparison meant to highlight both the shadow economy's size and its ability to siphon money away from tax-paying enterprises. Newspapers, particularly in New York, found in these cases a ready story. Photographs accompanying articles showed Napoli escorted by officers, or sitting in court in a suit and tie, looking more like a conventional businessman than the stereotype of a hardened criminal. Headlines stressed his alleged rank within the Lucchese family and repeated official claims that he was, at that time, perhaps the largest bookmaker in the country. Reporters sometimes contrasted his public modesty with the immense figures attributed to his operations, noting that the man who was said to have overseen tens of millions in bets moved through the courthouse without visible entourage or ostentatious wealth. Inside the courtroom, though, the tone shifted from spectacle to technical argument. Defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of wiretaps, argued that the prosecution had overreached in attributing responsibility for wide-ranging activities to their clients, and pushed back against attempts to brand their clients as kingpins based on association rather than direct evidence. They pointed out that gambling, while illegal, was a consensual activity, involving willing participants on both sides. Without dismissing the charges, they sought to distinguish their clients from those accused of more obviously harmful crimes, emphasizing the absence of allegations of violence in the indictments. Prosecutors responded by returning to the theme that had animated organized crime investigations since the Kefauver era: the idea that illegal gambling was not an isolated vice, but a central revenue stream. They brought in agents and analysts to testify about how money from betting could be used to influence local politics, compromise law enforcement officers through bribery, and support the operations of crime families more broadly. In some cases, witnesses described payoffs to corrupt officials or efforts to avoid raids through advance tips, matters that underscored the way clandestine betting enterprises, by their nature, encouraged the erosion of public trust in institutions meant to enforce the law. For Napoli personally, the consequences of this new round of prosecutions were cumulative. Each indictment carried the risk of additional imprisonment. Each conviction, if it came, further solidified his public identity as a central figure in organized gambling. Even when he avoided the most severe outcomes, through acquittals on certain counts, plea agreements on lesser charges, or sentences mitigated by age and health, he could not escape the steady erosion of anonymity that had once shielded him. Court records and press coverage ensured that his name, face, and alleged role were preserved in public memory, in ways that the more discreet bookmakers of earlier decades had rarely experienced. His advancing age did become a factor in some proceedings. Accounts from the early 1980s describe him as a man in his 70s, sometimes using a cane, whose health was a subject of discussion in bail hearings and sentencing arguments. Attorneys cited medical conditions in seeking leniency or delayed incarceration, arguing that long prison terms would amount to de facto life sentences. Judges, for their part, had to balance humanitarian considerations with the legal obligations attached to the statutes under which he was charged. The result was a patchwork of outcomes: In some cases, significant but not maximum sentences. In others, combinations of prison time, probation, and fines. The broader underworld context in which these events unfolded was itself shifting. The early to mid-1980s saw landmark prosecutions such as the so-called Commission case, in which federal authorities used RICO to charge leaders of several major New York crime families with collectively controlling and profiting from a range of illegal activities. Although Napoli was not among the defendants in that particular trial, the case signaled to everyone in his milieu that the era of partial impunity was ending. The same techniques that had been honed against gambling operations, long-term wiretaps, informants, financial analysis, were now being deployed against the highest ranks of the mafia's leadership. Within the Lucchese family, change was also underway. Aging figures who had come of age in the Prohibition or immediate post-war periods were gradually replaced, formally or informally, by younger men who had grown up in a world where the risks of high-profile criminal careers were more obvious. Some of those younger figures sought to diversify into other rackets they deemed more immediately profitable, such as narcotics trafficking or sophisticated financial frauds. Others, mindful of the attention now focused on traditional mafia organizations, tried to keep a lower profile or to rely more heavily on legitimate fronts. In this evolving hierarchy, Napoli's continued prominence as a bookmaker was both an asset and a liability. He brought experience, networks, and a reputation for reliability. He also brought an extensive law enforcement file and a level of notoriety that made any operation bearing his imprint a likely magnet for investigation. Despite mounting legal pressures, illegal sports betting did not abate. If anything, it grew more embedded in American popular culture. Newspapers began running regular columns listing point spreads alongside straight sports coverage. Television commentators sometimes alluded, cautiously, to the betting implications of particular games. While official league policies condemned gambling, and scandals periodically erupted around players or referees accused of improper associations, the reality remained that a significant portion of the audience watched sports with at least some awareness of the betting lines. Bookmakers, legal and illegal, adapted accordingly. In Las Vegas and other jurisdictions where sports betting was permitted in regulated form, casinos offered lines on major events. On the East Coast and in countless other regions, illegal bookmakers continued to serve customers who preferred credit, anonymity, or the convenience of a phone call to a familiar number. In that crowded marketplace, Napoli's alleged role as a high-level banker maintained relevance. Smaller bookmakers, facing weeks when results went against them, still needed somewhere to lay off risk, and the structures built over decades did not vanish simply because certain individuals were imprisoned or retired. Law enforcement agents monitoring conversations during this period noted with some frustration that even successful prosecutions did not permanently dismantle demand. Each time a major figure was convicted, others moved into the space they left. The specific configuration of networks changed, but the underlying pattern, informal, trust-based betting economies coexisting with formal legal prohibitions, remained stubbornly in place. For the communities where he had lived and worked, Napoli's story elicited mixed reactions. Some locals, interviewed anonymously or in passing by journalists, recalled him as a familiar, almost neighborly presence. A man who had always dressed neatly, who offered a word of greeting, who might quietly provide financial assistance in times of need. Others emphasized the less benign side of his trade, mentioning friends or relatives whose lives had been disrupted by gambling debts, financial strain, or the anxiety that came with owing money to people with reputations for enforcement. Social scientists studying these neighborhoods in the late 20th century noted that such ambivalence was typical. Figures like Napoli occupied complex social roles, combining elements of patron, employer, and exploiter, their influence neither entirely negative nor genuinely altruistic. As the 1980s progressed, the cumulative weight of his legal history, his age, and the changing shape of organized crime placed constraints on what he could realistically do. Even assuming a desire to remain active in the only business he had ever truly known, the practicalities of modern enforcement made a return to his mid-century peak impossible. Younger associates might seek his advice or enjoy his company at social clubs, but the days when he could oversee, with relative insulation, vast telephone-based networks of bookmakers across multiple states were over. Technology that had once served him so well, the ubiquitous telephone, had become, through advances in legal surveillance, a major vulnerability. The tolerance that local authorities had once shown toward gambling as a lower priority offense had given way, at least in high-profile cases, to a willingness to impose serious penalties. Still, his name retained a kind of resonance. When newspapers wrote retrospective pieces on organized crime in New York, or when television documentaries began to explore the history of the mafia for mass audiences, Jimmy Knapp often appeared as the archetypal bookmaker, a man whose career spanned from the rough-edged post-Prohibition years through the era of high-tech federal investigations. To law enforcement veterans of a certain age, he represented a long, difficult struggle to bring sophisticated illegal enterprises within the reach of the courts. To some within the underworld, he embodied a fatting model of organized crime, one rooted in gambling and local influence, rather than in the more overt and often more destructive enterprises that would come to characterize later periods. By the end of this long arc, Napoli's life was increasingly defined by the intersection of personal decline and institutional memory. His health inevitably worsened with age. Legal proceedings, even when they did not result in immediate incarceration, consumed time and energy. Yet the record he left, arrest reports, surveillance notes, court transcripts, and the recollections of those who had investigated or known him, ensured that his story would not vanish into obscurity. Instead, it would stand as a case study in how an individual, shaped by the constraints and opportunities of a specific time and place, could build a livelihood in defiance of the law, and how, over decades, the state adjusted its methods in an effort to contain and deter such careers. By the time the 1980s opened, James Napoli had become as much a fixture in law enforcement briefings as he once had been in the back rooms of betting parlors. His name appeared in pooled investigative reports, on organizational charts mapping the Lucchese family, and in the internal shorthand of FBI and state organized crime squads. He was Jimmy Knapp, the archetypal bookmaker whose career spanned from the days when gambling busts were little more than an occasional cost of doing business to an era in which the federal government was determined to dismantle illegal betting as a central support beam of organized crime. The seriousness of that determination showed in the way new cases against him were built. Gone were the quick strikes that yielded stacks of betting slips and a handful of low-level arrests. In their place were long-running investigations that sought to document not just isolated acts of taking bets, but the existence of continuing criminal enterprises. Investigators followed the same basic trail they always had: money, communications, and people, but with new patience and tools. Court-authorized wiretaps now ran for months instead of days, their transcripts indexed and cross-referenced. Teams of agents and detectives rotated on surveillance posts outside suspected wire rooms, apartments, and social clubs. Every scrap of paper seized in raids was cataloged, copied, and analyzed, not just for proof of individual bets, but for the patterns that might tie disparate defendants into a single, legally recognizable organization. In several major operations in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Napoli emerged at or near the top of the charts that prosecutors unveiled when they announced indictments. Press conferences following those indictments featured large display boards, familiar now from countless organized crime cases, in which photographs of defendants were connected by lines indicating alleged roles and relationships. Napoli's image, often that of an older man in glasses and conservative dress, appeared at a central node. Officials described him to reporters as a principal banker or backer of multi-million-dollar sports betting schemes. They alleged that operations tied to him handled action from college and professional football, basketball, and other major sports, that they serviced bookmakers and bettors in multiple states, and that, in some seasons, the total volume of wagers they processed ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Those figures, drawn from extrapolations of seized records and intercepted calls, were necessarily estimates, but the broad outlines were consistent with what investigators had long suspected about his reach. In one widely reported case, authorities executed simultaneous raids on locations in New York and other states, seizing phones, ledgers, coded sheets, and cash. They described entering modest apartments or back offices fitted with multiple telephone lines, spaces that outwardly resembled ordinary living or work quarters but functioned, in their view, as critical nerve centers where bets from far-flung bookmakers were logged, lines were adjusted, and results were computed. The details differed from case to case, but the essential structure was recognizable. Smaller operators in different locales taking wagers and then, when their own exposure grew too great, telephoning a central figure or figures for relief. The indictments that followed were dense documents, running through dozens of counts and nomming numerous defendants. Against Napoli, prosecutors typically brought conspiracy charges tied to illegal gambling statutes, sometimes in combination with alleged violations of the Federal Wire Act or, in certain instances, RICO provisions. The inclusion of RICO was especially significant. It signaled that the government saw his activities not merely as discrete crimes, but as part of a pattern of conduct within an ongoing criminal enterprise. The very language the statute was designed to address. To sustain such charges in court, the prosecution had to show not just that illegal gambling occurred, but that it was organized, enduring, and connected to a broader structure like the Lucchese family. This requirement shaped the presentation of evidence at trial. Jurors heard not only from technical experts who explained how betting lines worked and how bookmakers laid off bets, but also from law enforcement witnesses who described the history and organization of the Lucchese family and its peers. Charts annotated with decades of intelligence reports were distilled into manageable narratives for the courtroom, where the family had operated, how it was structured, and what role various members were believed to play. Within that story, gambling occupied a prominent place. It was, agents testified, one of the least visible yet most reliable revenue streams, a business that quietly turned everyday interest in sports and games of chance into a steady flow of unreported income. Wiretap transcripts were central to these cases. Prosecutors introduced selected calls in which they argued coded language concealed the discussion of bets and balances. A conversation that sounded on the surface like talk of numbers, sides, or figures was, in their interpretation, a discussion about point spreads, amounts wagered, and the need to move part of the action to someone with deeper pockets. On some calls, they said, voices identified by agents as belonging to bookmakers in one city discussed sending something upstairs, or covering heavy play on a particular side of a game, phrases the government interpreted as references to laying off bets with a central banker. Defense attorneys mounted multi-layered challenges to this picture. They questioned the identification of voices on tapes, pointed out that many of the phrases prosecutors seized on were ambiguous, and argued that what the government saw as a cohesive enterprise was, in fact, a patchwork of independent bookmakers pursuing their own interests. Even when they did not deny that illegal gambling took place, they pushed back hard against efforts to link ordinary bookmaking to a RICO enterprise controlled by any single person. In this telling, Napoli was cast as a convenient emblem for prosecutors eager to show progress against organized crime, a man whose past convictions and notoriety made him an attractive target, but whose actual day-to-day activities, they argued, did not match the scale and coordination alleged. Judges took these arguments seriously, issuing detailed rulings on what evidence juries could and could not hear. Some wiretap intercepts were excluded as overly prejudicial or insufficiently tied to the defendants. Others were allowed in, sometimes accompanied by instructions that jurors should give careful consideration to alternative, non-criminal interpretations. The defense also raised concerns about the breadth of RICO, echoing arguments playing out in appellate courts across the country, that the statute risked sweeping in individuals who were, at most, loosely connected to one another and criminalizing patterns of behavior that had traditionally been prosecuted under narrower, more specific laws. Despite these challenges, several of the major cases brought against Napoli in this period ended in convictions on at least some counts. Sentences varied with the charges and the judge. In some instances, he received multi-year federal prison terms. In others, combinations of incarceration, probation, and fines. Age and health were sometimes cited by both sides, by prosecutors as reasons to accelerate proceedings, and by the defense as grounds for leniency. The result was that, through his 70s, he alternated between periods of confinement and stretches of limited freedom under close supervision, a cyclical pattern echoing earlier phases of his life, but now set against a far more public and formalized anti-organized crime campaign. While these trials unfolded, the national story of American gambling was changing around him. Legalized state lotteries spread across the country, promoted as voluntary ways to fund education and other public programs. Nevada, long the only state with broad legal casino gambling, was joined by new jurisdictions as Atlantic City opened casinos in the late 1970s, and riverboat and Native American gaming expanded in the 1980s and early 1990s. Sports leagues, while still officially opposed to betting, saw their games increasingly discussed in media through the lens of point spreads and over-under totals. The vocabulary and logic of bookmaking seeped into mainstream conversation in a way that would have been difficult to imagine when Napoli first entered the trade decades earlier. This did not render illegal bookmakers obsolete. Many bettors continued to prefer the anonymity, credit, flexible betting options, and personal relationships that underground operators offered. Legal betting windows rarely extended to certain college games, local events, or the kinds of exotic wagers that illegal bookmakers were willing to entertain. Moreover, legal sports betting outside Nevada remained largely prohibited, leaving a vast space in which illicit networks could function. Nevertheless, the rise of legal gambling did have an impact on public perception. The moral line that earlier reformers had drawn between respectable citizens and criminal gamblers blurred as more people bought lottery tickets or visited casinos. For prosecutors, this made the task of convincing jurors that someone like Napoli was not merely a man engaged in the same pastime as millions of others, but a central figure in an unregulated, untaxed, and corrupting enterprise, a more nuanced challenge. Within the Lucchese family and the broader mafia landscape, the utility and status of old-line bookmakers like Napoli were also evolving. The intense federal attention drawn by large bookmaking conspiracies made some younger figures wary of tying their fortunes too closely to that racket. At the same time, the reliability of gambling income, especially compared to the volatility and heightened penalties associated with narcotics trafficking, ensured that many crime families continued to value experienced bookmakers. In this environment, Napoli's long track record, knowledge, and connections were still assets, even as his legal troubles and advancing years limited his ability to operate at the scale he once had. The human cost of these developments on Napoli and those around him can be glimpsed only indirectly through court records and press reports. Each indictment meant not only the prospect of prison, but also the seizure or freezing of assets alleged to be tied to criminal activity. Defense costs mounted over years of proceedings, and travel to and from court appearances and prisons imposed burdens on family members and associates. Bail conditions, where granted, often restricted his movements, barred contact with certain individuals, and subjected his home and communications to scrutiny. These constraints, routine in modern organized crime cases, marked a sharp contrast with the relative freedom he had enjoyed in earlier decades when gambling laws were enforced less systematically. For investigators and prosecutors who had spent much of their careers studying him, securing convictions against Napoli was more than a matter of personal accountability. It represented to them the culmination of a long institutional learning curve. They had watched as older generations of law enforcement raided the same small betting parlors over and over without altering the underlying economics of illegal gambling. By assembling larger, more complex cases that reached higher into the underworld's hierarchy, they believed they were finally addressing the systemic nature of the problem. In interviews and memoirs, some of these officials later cited the pursuit of figures like Napoli as examples of how sustained, patient work could erode even the most entrenched criminal careers. Yet even in victory, they acknowledged the limits of what such prosecutions could accomplish. Illegal betting did not disappear after any single conviction or set of convictions. It adapted, shifting to new technologies and new organizational forms. In the closing years of Napoli's life, early versions of computer-based betting and offshore operations began to appear, foreshadowing the internet-driven transformations that would come after his death. The basic demand, people's willingness to risk money on the outcome of unpredictable events, remained as strong as ever, even as the means by which that demand was served evolved. For Napoli himself, the final arc of his story unfolded in relative quiet compared to the media attention that had followed his major prosecutions. Advancing age and declining health reduced his public visibility, while his name continued to appear in retrospective accounts of the Lucchese family and histories of American organized crime. New figures took center stage in law enforcement priorities and in popular imagination. The crimes that drew the most attention in the late 1980s and early 1990s often involved narcotics, corporate fraud, or violent street gangs, areas where the consequences were more immediately shocking than the hidden losses of illegal gambling. When he died in the early 1990s, newspaper obituaries and brief wire stories marked his passing with the by then familiar labels: Lucchese Capo, reputed top bookmaker, longtime target of organized crime investigations. They summarized his career in a few compressed sentences. Born in New York to Italian parents, rose through the ranks of the underworld, oversaw large-scale gambling operations, convicted several times, spent years in prison. Some noted that at the height of his activity, law enforcement officials had called him one of, if not the largest bookmakers in the United States. Others reflected on the irony that he had lived long enough to see gambling, once treated as an unambiguous moral and legal wrong, become an accepted and heavily advertised component of mainstream entertainment in many parts of the country. In the years since, scholars and journalists studying organized crime have returned to his case as an instructive example. His life illustrates how the children of early 20th century immigrants navigated limited economic opportunities, how small-scale neighborhood hustles could grow into national networks, and how the state's response to such developments evolved over the course of a century. It also underscores a recurring theme in the history of vice, that efforts to prohibit deeply rooted human behaviors, whether drinking, as in Prohibition, or gambling, can create illicit markets that are difficult to control, and that, in turn, foster complex, enduring criminal enterprises. As an individual, James "Jimmy" Napoli has long since left the stage. The betting slips he once relied on have yellowed. The telephones in the apartments and back rooms he used have been replaced by technologies he never lived to see. Yet the issues his career raises, about the line between acceptable risk and criminal exploitation, about the capacity of law to shape behavior in markets driven by desire and habit, and about the long shadows cast by early life circumstances, continue to resonate. His story remains, not as a romanticized tale of outlaw ingenuity, but as a case study in the entanglement of personal choice, structural constraint, and the enduring, complicated attraction of the wager. Once James Napoli was gone, what remained of him in any concrete sense could be fitted onto shelves and into file boxes. His name lingered not on bookmakers' ledgers or the speed dial lists of runners, but in the clipped language of memoranda, the formal cadences of court transcripts, and the summaries of law enforcement reports. For decades he had existed in two overlapping worlds, the informal, face-to-face universe of bettors and bookmakers, and the formal record built slowly by the institutions that pursued him. With his death in the early 1990s, only the latter remained. The living networks he had helped coordinate dissolved or evolved, but the paper and microfilm trail they had left behind grew, as historians and crime analysts turned back to these documents to puzzle out how a bookmaker from a New York immigrant neighborhood had come to be described as one of the most significant gambling figures of his time. Much of what is known about his operations comes from those official sources. FBI files, police intelligence reports, grand jury minutes, and trial exhibits preserve the details that day-to-day participants had once tried so hard to hide. Coded sheets seized in raids, columns of initials and numbers that had once made sense only to insiders, were painstakingly decoded by investigators and presented in court, where they entered the public record. Transcripts of telephone calls intercepted under court order turned fragments of conversation into fixed texts that could be revisited, reanalyzed, and eventually quoted in books and documentaries. Even the dry administrative notes, surveillance logs recording when he entered and exited a social club, for example, have, in retrospect, become part of the raw material from which his story is reconstructed. For the agencies that had pursued him, these records served a practical purpose long before they acquired historical interest. They were tools of institutional memory. Younger agents and detectives joining organized crime squads could be handed fat dossiers on figures like Napoli and told, in effect, this is how the old guard operated. This is what a long-running, sophisticated gambling enterprise looks like when you finally drag it into the light. Training materials in the 1980s and 1990s, designed to explain to recruits how illegal betting networks functioned, often drew on anonymized or redacted elements of cases against bookmakers whose careers had spanned decades. The patterns those documents revealed, the way lines were set and shared, the role of the banker, the circuit of layoff calls before major games, were the same patterns that had defined Napoli's work. Outside law enforcement circles, his name took on a different sort of afterlife. Journalists who had covered his cases, particularly in New York, occasionally wrote retrospective pieces on the old-time, mob bookmaker in contrast to newer forms of organized crime. They highlighted the generational span of his career. A man born before World War I who had learned his trade long before wiretaps and RICO, yet found himself, in old age, grappling with tools of enforcement that didn't exist when he picked up his first racing sheet. These accounts sometimes framed him as a relic of an earlier era, someone whose world of numbers, point spreads, and neighborhood phone calls seemed almost quaint compared to the violence and international reach associated with later drug cartels or transnational fraud schemes. That framing was not entirely accurate. There was nothing quaint about the financial and social damage large-scale illegal gambling could cause, but it spoke to a broader shift in public focus. By the late 20th century, the most visible crises confronting American cities involved drugs, gun violence, and financial crimes with global implications. Illegal bookmaking, which had once loomed large in newspaper exposés and Senate hearings, receded somewhat from the center of public anxiety. It continued, but as legalized gambling expanded and other forms of organized crime seized headlines, figures like Napoli slipped into a kind of half-shadow, still important to specialists, but less present in everyday discourse. For Italian-American communities, the legacy of people like him was still more complicated. From the mid-20th century onward, civic organizations, religious leaders and scholars had pushed back against the easy conflation of Italian ethnicity with organized crime. They pointed out rightly that the vast majority of Italian Americans had built their lives through ordinary work, and that the focus on the mafia in media and law enforcement often obscured the community's broader contributions. At the same time, they could not deny that high-profile figures such as Napoli existed and had, for decades, operated in certain Italian-American neighborhoods. Community voices tried to hold two truths together: that his life story was in some ways a product of structural conditions, poverty, discrimination, limited legitimate opportunities, that had confronted many in the early and mid-20th century, and that he had nonetheless made choices that deepened harmful patterns and reinforced stereotypes. Some writers emphasize the weight of those early conditions, situating his entry into the underworld within the context of overcrowded tenements, exploitative labor practices, and a legal economy that often closed doors to people of his background. Others focused more on the consequences of his choices, pointing to the ways illegal gambling and the presence of organized crime distorted local politics, corrupted institutions, and placed invisible burdens on families struggling with addiction and debt. Academic work on illegal gambling and organized crime, which grew more sophisticated in the 1970s and 1980s, often used his case as one of several detailed examples. Criminologists interested in the business side of organized crime examined bookmaking operations like his to illustrate how illicit enterprises mimicked, in some respects, legitimate firms. They noted the attention to risk diversification, the investment in information, the importance of trust networks, and the division of labor between front-line sales, the street bookmakers and back office, finance, the bankers and layoff men. In papers and monographs, descriptions of Napoli's alleged role as a central figure who absorbed the excess action of dozens of smaller bookmakers, coordinated odds, and kept comprehensive records, served as empirical grounding for theories about how criminal markets organized themselves in the absence of legal enforceability. Legal scholars, meanwhile, found in his prosecutions useful case studies of how new statutes were being applied. His career intersected with the early use of the Wire Act, the development of standard practices for electronic surveillance, and the expansion of conspiracy law in organized crime contexts. Appellate decisions arising from his and similar cases helped clarify when and how wiretap evidence could be used, what constituted sufficient proof of participation in a criminal enterprise, and how far RICO could reach in treating a set of loosely coordinated illegal acts as part of a single organized scheme. In this sense, Napoli's life did not just illustrate the history of crime. It also left marks on the history of American criminal procedure. Looking back with the benefit of time, some commentators have argued that the cat and mouse dynamic between bookmakers like him and the state had broader policy implications. On one side was a long tradition of moral and legal opposition to gambling, rooted in concerns about addiction, family welfare, and public order. On the other was the evident persistence of betting in everyday life, despite repeated crackdowns. Napoli's career, stretching across half a century and multiple waves of enforcement, appeared to underscore how resilient that demand was. Even when he was in prison, other bookmakers stepped in. Even when a multi-state ring was dismantled, new configurations emerged. To some policy analysts, this pattern suggested that prohibition alone, without regulated alternatives, would always leave space for unregulated, criminally controlled markets. Yet those same analysts were careful not to romanticize the illegal operators as simply meeting a harmless popular desire. They pointed to the ways in which clandestine betting fostered other forms of harm: the exploitation of vulnerable bettors, the use of gambling profits to support more damaging criminal enterprises, and the corrosion of institutions through bribery and intimidation. Napoli's own story, as reconstructed from official records, contained elements of all these dynamics. Informants and court exhibits described efforts to protect operations from law enforcement interference through corrupt contacts. The pressure applied, short of overt physical violence, but nonetheless coercive, on those slow to pay debts, and the steady diversion of large sums of untaxed money away from public revenues. In the decades after his death, as digital technology transformed nearly every aspect of commerce and communication, his era of telephones and paper ledgers began to look remarkably distant. Yet in important respects, the structures he had inhabited anticipated those of the emerging online betting world. Modern sports betting enterprises, whether legal, regulated sportsbooks or illicit offshore sites, share certain core features. Centralized line setting informed by data and expertise, distributed points of contact with customers, and systems for balancing risk across large pools of bets. When historians of gambling write about the evolution from neighborhood bookies to internet platforms, they often highlight this continuity. In their narrative, figures like Napoli occupy a transitional stage. Men who perfected a telephone-based, geographically dispersed model that could, with new technology, scale up dramatically. If technology altered the form of betting, it also changed the nature of surveillance. Where investigators in his time strained to match voices to phone numbers and to interpret cryptic notations on paper slips, their successors began to parse digital logs, trace IP addresses, and analyze financial transactions in real time. The legal framework, too, evolved. In 1992, around the time of Napoli's death, Congress passed the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA, which effectively barred most states from legalizing sports betting. That law aimed in part at reinforcing the line between legitimate sports and gambling interests, held for more than 2 decades before being overturned by the Supreme Court in 2018. By then, Napoli's name surfaced occasionally in historical retrospectives, his once cutting-edge telephone network now overshadowed by discussions of mobile apps and online wagering platforms. This modern context has reshaped how some people interpret the significance of his career. To an earlier generation, the image of a single bookmaker allegedly coordinating tens of millions in bets across multiple states seemed almost unprecedented, a staggering concentration of illegal activity in one pair of hands. To observers accustomed to the scale of today's legal and illegal betting markets, those numbers, while still impressive, do not seem as singular. What stands out instead is the way he navigated the transition from small-time neighborhood operations to an intermediate, semi-national network long before such coordination was technically streamlined. He did so using the tools available at the time: telephones, physical ledgers, personal relationships. And in that sense, his innovations were organizational rather than technological. At the same time, a closer look at his life through contemporary lenses has amplified, rather than diminished, awareness of the harms that trailed his success. Modern public health research on gambling addiction has documented with far greater precision than contemporaries could the pathways by which casual betting can, for some individuals, become compulsive and destructive. Retrospective accounts from families affected by illegal gambling debt, stories that may not have made front-page news in his day, have found their way into sociological and journalistic studies. In them, the bookmaker is not an abstract figure in a wiretap transcript, but a presence whose decisions shape the monthly crises of household budgets, the stress of constant financial uncertainty, and the erosion of trust when a parent or spouse repeatedly lied about losses. While no archive records every instance in which Napoli's operations intersected with such personal dramas, the scale at which he operated makes clear that they must have been numerous. Each column of figures in a seized ledger represented human decisions and consequences, money wagered that could otherwise have gone to rent, savings, or education, fleeting hopes of windfalls that, statistically, mostly failed to materialize, debts to be collected in neighborhoods where social standing and personal safety could be subtly, but powerfully, affected by one's reputation as a payer or non-payer. In this light, the argument sometimes advanced in his defense that gambling was a victimless crime rings thin. Engaging with his story today, especially in the format of detailed documentaries and long-form analyses, demands a balance that earlier sensationalist accounts did not always maintain. It is tempting to treat men like Napoli as characters in a drama, clever, resourceful, pitted against determined investigators, because such framing lends itself to compelling storytelling. But the historical record, stripped of cinematic gloss, shows a more prosaic reality: routine, repetitive labor in both the illegal and enforcement camps, punctuated by occasionally dramatic confrontations in raids and courtrooms. It reveals a man whose skill lay not in daring exploits but in disciplined, often tedious work with numbers and phones, and a state apparatus that responded with its own slow, methodical accumulation of evidence. That perspective does not erase the interest in his life. If anything, it deepens it. Seeing him as an ordinary person shaped by specific historical and structural forces, rather than as a mythic outlaw, helps clarify what his story can and cannot explain. It can illuminate the economic logic of illegal markets, the adaptability of organized crime, and the evolution of American criminal law. It cannot, on its own, resolve the perennial questions those fields raise: how best to regulate or restrict potentially harmful behaviors, how to design enforcement strategies that minimize unintended consequences, or how to address the underlying inequities that make certain illicit economies appealing in the first place. In the end, James "Jimmy" Napoli stands in the historical record as a densely documented example of a certain kind of 20th century American criminal career. Born into a world where his ethnic community faced sharp obstacles, he found in illegal gambling a path to influence and relative wealth, at the cost of repeated confrontations with the law and involvement in enterprises that harmed others in ways not always immediately visible. Over decades, as the state's tools sharpened and its understanding of organized crime matured, that path narrowed, leading to major convictions, prison time, and a final chapter marked by age and illness, rather than the commanding role he had once held in his clandestine sphere. His story, read now through the layers of documents and memories left behind, offers neither simple condemnation nor easy exoneration. It instead invites a more measured reflection on how individual choices interact with historical circumstance, and on how societies struggle, through law, policy, and culture, to respond when enduring human impulses, like the desire to wager on uncertain outcomes, spill into forbidden channels and give rise to enduring and often damaging underground worlds. In the years after James Napoli's death, the struggle to define what exactly he had been and what his story meant did not end. It simply shifted from courtrooms and police briefings to bookshelves, seminar rooms, and living room screens. His name, which had once appeared in daily arrest reports and wire service crime briefs, resurfaced in a slower, more reflective way, as authors, documentarians, and scholars tried to make sense of the long arc of 20th century organized crime in America. Any attempt to trace that arc through the prism of illegal gambling could not avoid him. Yet how they chose to portray Jimmy as mastermind, as symptom, as emblem, or as something more ambiguous, varied considerably, revealing the tensions that still run through discussions of crime, law, and responsibility. One of the first questions these later accounts confronted was how literally to take the labels law enforcement had used during his lifetime. Calling someone the biggest bookmaker in the country made for compelling headlines, but it was, by nature, a claim that could not be conclusively proved. Illegal markets do not file audited financial statements. Estimates of the sums moving through Napoli's networks were based on partial records seized in raids, intercepted calls over limited windows of time, and informants whose knowledge was, in turn, confined to their own slice of the underworld. Historians and crime reporters poring over those sources after the fact learned to approach such superlatives with caution. They noted that officials had institutional reasons to emphasize the size and importance of their targets. Doing so underscored the seriousness of their work and justified the resources devoted to major investigations. Yet skepticism did not mean dismissal. Even if his title as number one could never be mathematically secured, there was little doubt that he ranked near the top of his field for many years. The sheer persistence with which authorities pursued him, the geographic reach described in dozens of indictments, and the volume of case material attached to his name all pointed in the same direction. At a minimum, he stood as one of a small cadre of bookmakers who, by mid-century, had transformed what had once been mostly local, cash and handshake operations into coordinated, telephone-linked systems spanning multiple states. That alone warranted attention, not only from those interested in the history of crime, but also from those studying how illegal and legal markets evolve. Another challenge facing those who revisited his life was how to balance the different narratives that had surrounded him while he was alive. Law enforcement files presented him primarily as a problem to be solved, a node in a network, a target whose removal would, in theory, weaken the financial base of a crime family. Media coverage, although fed by official statements, often layered its own drama onto that frame, casting him as a kind of quiet mastermind behind a shadowy empire of betting slips and ringing phones. Community memories painted yet another picture. Some residents recalled a courteous older man who bought coffee, contributed to church events, or inquired about neighbors' illnesses. Others recalled the fear that lurked behind unpaid debts or the quiet knowledge that certain establishments in the neighborhood operated under the protection of people like him. Later analysts tried to hold these different perspectives together without flattening them into caricature. In doing so, they often emphasized that organized crime figures like Napoli inhabited roles produced by and reinforcing broader social structures. He did not create the appetite for gambling, he exploited it. He did not single-handedly invent the economic marginalization of immigrant communities. He found in that marginalization an opening for careers that the formal labor market denied. At the same time, to insist too strongly on structural explanations risked effacing individual agency. Other men from similar backgrounds chose different paths. Even within the underworld, there were choices about how far to go in collecting debts, how aggressively to corrupt officials, and whether to seek growth at all costs or accept the limits of smaller-scale operations. That tension between system and choice echoes through the way his story is now used in discussions of public policy. Debates over gambling regulation, for example, frequently invoke the history of illegal bookmaking as both a cautionary and an explanatory tale. Advocates for legalized, regulated sports betting have argued that prohibition created the conditions under which figures like Napoli could flourish. By making ordinary, widespread behavior a crime, the state effectively granted a monopoly to those willing to operate outside the law, with all the attendant risks of corruption and exploitation. Pointing to the mid-century networks he was alleged to have overseen, they suggest that regulated markets with transparent odds, consumer protections, and tax contributions might be preferable to leaving such demand entirely to clandestine entrepreneurs. Opponents of broad gambling expansion, however, take a different lesson. For them, his career underscores the scale of harm that can arise when gambling opportunities are ubiquitous, whether legal or illegal. They note that the same social dynamics that funneled money into his wire rooms, hope, desperation, the allure of quick gain in communities with limited opportunity, can be intensified, not relieved, by easy access to betting, even under regulation. To this view, state-run lotteries and legalized sports books risk replicating, in sanitized form, the revenue extraction that once filled the pockets of bookmakers, with the added complication that the state now has a vested interest in citizens' continued participation. In this framing, Napoli is less an argument for changing the venue of gambling than a warning about its power to shape behavior and redistribute resources. His life also appears, sometimes unexpectedly, in debates over policing and civil liberties. The tools developed in part to monitor and prosecute him, long-term electronic surveillance, broad conspiracy charges, the use of cooperating witnesses from within criminal organizations, did not remain confined to cases like his. Over time, they were applied in other contexts, from terrorism investigations to white-collar fraud. Civil libertarians therefore look back at high-profile organized crime cases with a double eye, acknowledging the public interest in containing entrenched criminal enterprises, while also asking whether the expansion of state power in those cases has had consequences beyond its original targets. Wiretapping offers a clear example. In the era before the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, as earlier noted, the legal status of wiretaps was unsettled. The formalization of procedures in 1968 responded in part to the need for clearer standards in organized crime cases like those brought against Napoli. But once codified, these standards set precedents for electronic surveillance more broadly. Courts, in reviewing appeals in his and similar cases, hashed out doctrines that would later shape how police and intelligence agencies could intercept not only phone calls, but, by analogy, digital communications as well. In this sense, his presence in the case law forms a link between the mid-century world of bookmakers' phones and the contemporary concerns about privacy in an age of email and encrypted messaging. Cooperating witnesses present a related dilemma. Organized crime prosecutions in the 1970s and 1980s increasingly depended on insiders willing to testify about the operations of families like the Lucchese group. Some of those witnesses knew of Napoli's role from direct experience. Others knew him only by reputation within their organizations. Their testimony helped prosecutors connect the dots among phone records, surveillance notes, and financial documents. Yet the use of such witnesses has always raised questions about reliability and incentive. To secure reduced sentences or protection, cooperators might exaggerate the importance of certain figures or attribute greater coordination to events than actually existed. Later scholars, re-examining trials in which Napoli was a defendant, have tried to parse these testimonies carefully, comparing them with independent evidence to assess how much weight they should bear. The very fact that these questions continue to be discussed decades after his death speaks to the broader role that organized crime cases have played in shaping American legal doctrine. Napoli's name is not the only one that appears repeatedly in these debates, but his longevity and the breadth of his documented interactions with the justice system make his case a particularly rich vein to mine. Each major investigation into his activities reflects both the legal tools available at that moment and the prevailing theories about how best to tackle complex criminal networks. Tracing those investigations over time reveals a steady move from reactive, localized enforcement toward proactive, systemic strategies, a shift that has implications far beyond the specific vice of illegal gambling. There is, too, a cultural afterlife to his career that operates at a more diffuse level. While no major film or television series has explicitly portrayed James Napoli as a character, the figure of the veteran bookmaker, tied to an established family, calm and methodical rather than flamboyantly violent, recurs again and again in fictional representations of the underworld. Writers and screenwriters steeped, consciously or not, in news coverage and published histories draw on composite impressions of real figures like him when they craft such roles. The result is that, for many viewers and readers, the archetype of the Jimmy Knapp bookmaker, a man who deals in information, credit, and calculation rather than overt force, feels familiar even if his name is not. This interplay between reality and representation can blur lines in the public imagination. Fiction necessarily condenses and heightens. It often suggests a level of strategic control and narrative coherence that real criminal careers rarely possess. The documentary record of Napoli's life, by contrast, is full of contingency and messiness. Investigations hampered by limited resources, operations disrupted by chance observations, legal outcomes shaped by the idiosyncrasies of particular judges and juries. When modern documentaries seek to correct the distortions of fiction, they often turn to his and similar cases to illustrate that much of organized crime, especially in domains like gambling, is more about routine, repetitive activity than about singular acts of drama. The tension of the era in which he operated lay as much in the slow grind of enforcement and enterprise as it did in any headline-grabbing raid. As the 21st century has unfolded, the specific neighborhoods and institutions that framed his rise have continued to change. Many of the Italian-American enclaves that once housed Lucchese social clubs and off-the-books betting rooms have seen demographic shifts. New immigrant groups have arrived. Old tenements have been renovated or replaced. Local economies have diversified. In some places, former haunts of bookmakers have become cafes, boutiques, or upscale apartments. A few physical traces remain: faded signage, old phone lines in basements. But, for the most part, the geography of his world survives only in photographs and memories. Yet the underlying issues that gave his career its shape, questions of opportunity, regulation, and the human attraction to risk, are still with us, recast in new forms. When policymakers and citizens today debate how to handle emerging gray markets, whether in digital currencies, online betting, or other technologically mediated commerce, they confront dilemmas not wholly unlike those that confronted officials facing the telephone-based gambling networks of his day. Do they try to suppress such markets outright, risking the growth of clandestine operations? Do they seek to channel them into regulated forms, with the hope of mitigating harm and capturing revenue? How do they weigh individual freedom against collective welfare when the harms, as with gambling debts in Napoli's time, often manifest privately rather than in dramatic public incidents? In that sense, revisiting his story is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a way to ground contemporary debates in concrete experience. His life illustrates both the ingenuity with which people will organize to meet persistent demands, even when the law forbids it, and the capacity of the state to adapt in response, sometimes at the cost of expanding surveillance and punitive power. It shows the limitations of enforcement that targets only the most visible participants while leaving demand untouched, as well as the unintended consequences that can arise when certain activities are driven entirely underground. For audiences watching a documentary about him now, at a distance of decades, the task is to take in these layered meanings without losing sight of the particular human being at the center of the story. James, Jimmy Knapp, Napoli, was not simply a symbol or an archetype. He was a person whose choices, talents, and circumstances intersected with the broader currents of American history in ways that made his activities unusually visible. His life cannot and should not be abstracted into a simple moral, but it can, if examined carefully, illuminate the complex entanglement of law, vice, opportunity, and identity in 20th century urban America. Long after James Napoli's death, it is still possible to stand on certain corners of New York and feel, faintly, the outlines of the world that shaped him. The storefronts have changed, The languages have shifted and the rents have multiplied, but the basic rhythm of the city, the way people crowd into cramped spaces, calculate their chances, and look for an edge where they can find it, remains. If his name lingers at all now, it is usually in the pages of books or the captions of archival photographs. A suited man on the courthouse steps, a grainy face in a police lineup, a label on a law enforcement chart linking him to illegal gambling operations. Yet behind those static images lay a life that tracked, with unusual clarity, the centuries-changing bargains between law, vice, and opportunity. Seen from a distance, his story forms a clean arc. A boy born in 1911 to Italian immigrants in New York City grows up in overcrowded neighborhoods where legitimate advancement is possible but slow, and where informal economies, from day labor to small-stakes numbers games, fill the gaps left by low wages and discrimination. He drifts early into that gray zone where legality is blurred, finds that he has a knack for numbers and risk, and over decades builds a reputation as a calm, reliable bookmaker. As communication technology improves and society's appetite for betting grows, his business expands from local tracks and card rooms to a vast, telephone-linked network. Law enforcement, initially disorganized and constrained by weak statutes, eventually adapts, targeting not just street-level runners but the central bankers behind them. Under that pressure, he is arrested repeatedly, convicted in significant federal cases, and spends portions of his later life in prison. He dies in his early 80s, a man whose name once stood, in the words of prosecutors, for the pinnacle of illegal sports betting in America. For those who knew him directly, the picture would have been more granular. To neighbors in his middle and later years, he might have appeared as a courteous older man who dressed carefully, kept regular hours at certain cafes or social clubs, handed out small bills to neighborhood children on holidays, or nodded to familiar faces on the sidewalk. To bookmakers in other boroughs or states, his identity was more transactional. The banker they called when a week's bets left them overexposed, the voice on the other end of the line who, after a few clipped exchanges, would agree to take on a slice of their risk for a share of their potential profit. To law enforcement agents who tailed him from club to apartment and listened for his voice on wiretaps, he was a target whose habits and associations had to be mapped in exhausting detail. To judges and jurors encountering him in the courtroom, he was a defendant framed by prosecutors as a central node in organized crime, and by defense attorneys as an aging man whose alleged offenses involved numbers, not knives or guns. What unites these vantage points is the way they situate him at the intersection of individual agency and structural constraint. The early decades of his life unfolded in a context that channeled many young men from his background toward the margins of legality. Italian-American communities faced housing discrimination, employment barriers, and frequent hostility from both established elites and other immigrant groups. In that environment, the existence of an alternative economy, built on bootlegging during Prohibition, then on gambling and other rackets afterward, presented itself not just as a temptation, but, for some, as the most visible model of rapid upward mobility available. That fact does not absolve him of responsibility for his choices. Many of his contemporaries confronted similar pressures and chose different paths, grinding their way through low-paid factory jobs, opening small legitimate businesses, or pursuing education as a long shot out of poverty. But it does help explain why, once he discovered that he could earn money and status through bookmaking, returning to the limited wages and constrained respectability of the legal labor market would have seemed, to him, like a step backward. His career also tracks the institutional evolution of organized crime in the United States. In his youth, violent turf wars and sporadic extortion dominated the headlines. By his early adulthood, the Prohibition-era chaos had given way to more structured crime families that treated illegal enterprises, including gambling, as regular businesses. Within that world, A man who could keep accurate books, maintain trust with far-flung partners, and manage risk without panic was as valuable as any enforcer. Napoli's ascent as a bookmaker reflects this managerial turn. While others within the Lucchese family dealt in union corruption, cargo theft, or other rackets, his comparative advantage lay in the quiet, relentless arithmetic of wagering. For much of his working life, the law treated that arithmetic as a relatively minor offense. Local raids disrupted operations and produced arrests, but penalties were often light and sporadically enforced. The transformation began when national attention turned toward organized crime as a systemic problem rather than a series of isolated incidents. Senate hearings, state crime commissions, and federal task forces reframed figures like Napoli as not just neighborhood bookmakers, but as integral parts of a nationwide criminal infrastructure. The Wire Act and later statutes were drafted with precisely such networks in mind. In that sense, his eventual high-profile prosecutions were not accidents. They were the intended outcome of a decades-long shift in strategy. Evaluating the ethics and effectiveness of that shift requires grappling with competing narratives about harm. Supporters of aggressive enforcement argued, and still argue, that large-scale illegal gambling was far from harmless. They highlight the exploitation of bettors prone to addiction, the use of gambling proceeds to finance other criminal activities, and the corrupting influence of payoffs to police or public officials. In court and in the press, prosecutors described Napoli's operation as a multi-million-dollar business that paid no taxes, flouted regulations designed to protect consumers, and relied, ultimately, on the threat, implicit or explicit, that debts would be collected one way or another. Those who took a more lenient view often fell back on the idea of gambling as a victimless crime. They pointed out that his customers were willing participants, that many placed small bets as a form of entertainment, and that, compared to the physical violence associated with other rackets, bookmaking seemed less immediately destructive. Defense attorneys leaned on these themes when asking courts and juries to distinguish his alleged offenses from those involving street-level violence or coercion. Some community members, benefiting from the occasional generosity of men like him, found it difficult to regard them as simple predators. The historical record complicates both simplistic denunciation and easy romanticization. On the one hand, there is little evidence that Napoli sought to move into more overtly violent territory. His skill set and reputation were tied to numbers, not brutality. On the other hand, the scale at which he operated magnified the accumulated harms of gambling in ways not always visible on any single street. Families dealing with chronic losses and debt rarely showed up in police statistics. The steady diversion of disposable income into illegal betting reduced the resources available for other needs, particularly in already marginalized communities. The corrosive effect of even low-level corruption, tips about impending raids, overlooked violations, eroded confidence in institutions meant to be impartial. Looking back from the present, with a more robust understanding of addiction and economic vulnerability, those diffuse harms are easier to see. Public health researchers, economists, and sociologists have documented how exposure to frequent betting opportunities can exacerbate financial instability, how certain personality traits and life circumstances increase susceptibility to compulsive gambling, and how the resulting strains affect not just individuals but families and neighborhoods. When those dynamics are linked to illegal markets, where there is no recourse to regulators, no formal self-exclusion programs, and little transparency, the potential for exploitation grows. Napoli may not have invented those dynamics, but his success depended on them. His story also foregrounds the paradoxes in how societies deal with contested vices. Over the course of his life, the official stance on gambling shifted from near-blanket prohibition to selective legalization. State lotteries, horse race betting, and casino gaming all gained legal footholds, justified by the promise of tax revenue and the argument that, Since betting could not realistically be eradicated, it ought to be brought into the open and regulated. Meanwhile, sports betting, his particular domain, remained largely illegal outside Nevada for decades after his death, only to be legalized or considered for legalization in many states after the overturning of PASPA. The same cultural forces that had once driven bets to his phones, fascination with sports, a taste for risk, are now courted openly by advertising campaigns for legal sportsbooks and fantasy sports platforms. Would a different regulatory path, taken earlier, have altered his trajectory? It is impossible to say with certainty. Legalization does not eliminate illegal markets. They persist where regulations are restrictive, tax burdens are high, or segments of the population prefer anonymity and credit that regulated operators cannot or will not provide. What is clear is that, in the policy vacuum of his formative years, men like him could step into the role that governments and legitimate businesses did not yet occupy, shaping habits and expectations that have outlived their creators. In assessing his legacy, it is tempting to search for a single, definitive lesson, but history rarely offers such neat closure. Instead, his life can be read as a layered case study. It illustrates how early 20th century social and economic conditions in immigrant neighborhoods created fertile ground for certain kinds of illicit entrepreneurship. It shows how organized crime, far from being a static monolith, adapted to technological and legal changes over time, turning telephones into tools of coordination and adjusting structures in response to enforcement pressure. It demonstrates how the state's efforts to counter such adaptations expanded its own powers, with implications that extended far beyond the gambling world. Most of all, perhaps, his story underscores the persistence of certain human impulses, the desire to test one's luck, to find shortcuts to security or status, to feel connected to events larger than oneself through a wager on their outcome. Those impulses moved money through his hands for decades. They continue to move money today, through channels he could not have imagined. The task for contemporary societies is not to pretend that such impulses can be eradicated, but to think carefully about the environments in which they are expressed and the structures that profit from them. In the end, the man behind the moniker, Jimmy Nap, disappears into the broader patterns his life illuminates. The telephone numbers once associated with his operation have long since been reassigned. The apartments used as wire rooms have new occupants. The social clubs where he sat for hours over coffee and quiet conversations have closed or been repurposed. What remains are the traces, the court decisions that bear his name, the investigative files that still sit in archives, the passing references in histories of the Lucchese family and American gambling. For those willing to follow those traces, a complex, uneven, and deeply human story emerges, not of a legend, but of a working man in the underground economy, navigating, year after year, the shifting boundaries of law and opportunity. As night falls on the modern city and screens glow with live scores, betting odds, and instant wagers, it is worth remembering that not so long ago, those same urges flowed through different circuits, through whispered conversations, coded calls, and the mental calculations of men hunched over ledgers. Among them, for a time, was James Napoli. His world has vanished, but the questions it raises, about regulation and resistance, about responsibility and risk, about how societies respond when everyday desires cross into forbidden territory, are still with us, waiting, like the turn of a card or the bounce of a ball, to be reckoned with anew.